Rabbi, gentlemen.
Good morning. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Yesterday, we were learning about this machlokes between the Rambam and Rashi as far as to the scope of when you're going to be chayiv, depending upon what kind of domain the damage is caused in. And there's a lot of gray area here, as we said yesterday, but it seems that this machlokas between the Rambam and Rashi is the Rambam will hold that you're putter for damages if you damaged unintentionally, if the damage takes place in a place where you both have a right to be. But the Chazon Ish qualified that and said that the Rambam is only lenient to exempt you from payment when you did not do anything that would be considered hazardous or abnormal. You were engaged in perfectly normative activity. So again, big discrepancy and a lot of gray area. Just think about the guy who's in the stadium and just jumps up to cheer and knocks over everyone's stuff. Okay. Anyway, the next sif katan, you are liable for damaging your friend's property, and that all of a sudden triggers the question about what if you damage a non-Jew's property. So there's a machlokas over here. V'hamazik mamon shel nachri nami chayav v'yesh potrin. See here too, tremendous amount of gray area. There's one opinion that says that you're liable, just like you're liable for theft. When you steal from a non-Jew, you're also liable for damages when you damage a non-Jew's property, and there are those who say that you're putter. Now, the interesting thing is that there's a Gemara that says that when my property damages a Gentile's property, so let's say, for example, my ox gores his ox or gores his cow, so then the Talmud says that a Jew is putter in that situation if it was completely by accident. But when I personally injure another, a non-Jew, so that's where there's this machlokas. And we've already talked about stealing from a Gentile or utilizing anything that he gave to me for safekeeping. And of course, anytime there's dina de malchusa, which would obligate you to pay for damages, or where there's a chilul Hashem involved, then of course all bets are off. Then obviously you're going to be obligated to mitigate those in any way possible. Now, and here comes another huge gray area. How do you assess the damages? Okay, so this is in Sif Katan Dalid, that you're not even allowed to damage someone's property with the intention of compensating them afterwards. You can't just say, well, I'll break your item with the intention. I think there's a custom, I forget, someone told me there's a festival where somewhere in Germany or Austria, I can't remember, where at this festival, everyone comes with a pair of scissors and cuts the other person's tie. I'm trying to remember. Have you heard of such a thing? I was just told by a guest of mine, David Traub was a member of the shul. He told me that there's a big festival. Now I just can't remember the German city where, maybe it's Vienna, I'm not sure, where they have a big festival every year. You know what he was telling me? We were talking about the term Yeke. You've heard the term Yeke to refer to a German Jew. So a Yeke is a short jacket in German. And that's why they refer to German Jews as Yekes, because they would wear their short jacket in contradistinction to their more Eastern European counterparts who would wear longer jackets, longer coats. Okay, but he also told me that the word Yeke means an idiot in German, and they have a Yeke festival where people get together and just have a silly time, and the custom is that when you see a guy wearing a tie, you cut his tie. Okay, so anyway, let's say a guy doesn't want his tie to be cut, but you want to play a practical joke, right? They have these practical jokers, right? So they say, okay, we'll damage someone's property, but we'll give them some compensation, we'll cover their costs, and we'll give them a few extra dollars just to be in on the prank and to entertain the public. So that's not permitted. Even if your intention is to pay them back, you're not allowed to, according to the Torah, damage someone's property lechatchila. Now, what about the assessment of the damages, which is a very difficult thing to assess? So I go ahead and I cut someone's tie, silk tie that he bought 10 years ago on his trip to the Orient. It's a beautiful silk tie. When it was originally purchased, the retail value was a $50 tie, but he's had it for 10 years. It's gone through some good times, gone through some bad times, and now it's destroyed. Replacement value would be $50. But what about the usage of 10 years that he got out of the time? How do you assess the damages? And this, of course, there's probably tables of and methods to do this in secular law as well. But that's what we need to talk about today. The hamazik mishali mi'idis. So the first thing is there's a Gemara that talks about it. When you want to pay someone back, do you have to pay them cash or not? So the halacha is that if you owe someone money for damages, you can pay them in goods. You don't have to pay them in cash. You can pay them back in goods, and you can pay them back in real estate. So when you pay someone back in non-cash, so if you're going to pay them back, if you're coming to pay them back with real estate, you're not allowed to take a junky piece of real estate and assess its value and pay the person back with that piece of real estate. You're obligated, according to halacha, to pay back with idis. And the Gemara describes that there are three grades of real estate. There's ziboris, which is the lowest quality of real estate. There's beinanis, which is middle quality. And then there's idis, which is the highest quality. Now, what we mean by high quality is the most desirable real estate that will be sold the quickest. So there might be a valuable piece of property somewhere up I was just reading an article yesterday where you can get the best deals on homes. And there was some hick town up somewhere between here and Ottawa in Ontario that has the best real estate prices. So that might be your desire, is that if you have a piece of property somewhere out in northern Ontario that you'd like to pay the guy back with, you'd say, oh, that I'll just unload that piece of real estate. I've never been able to sell it, but it still has a market value. Well, the problem with that is that if he's going to have difficulty selling it, then the Chachamim did not allow you to use that as a form of restitution for damages. They only allowed you to give him something that he will be able to liquidate very easily, and that's what we call idis. Aval imrotze l'shalim imitaltalim, but if you want to pay him back with goods, with chattel, so yachal lifroa afilu subin, and you can give him any chattel you want. You can give him widgets, but you could also give him bran, which is the lowest quality of the grain production. In other words, it's this, bran, of course, people do use bran. It has a value. People use it to feed it to their animals. They use it for other purposes, but it's not considered to be it's considered to be the least valuable part of the wheat stock that you harvest. But since it's a tradable commodity and it's easily tradable, and it's no more difficult to trade bran than it is to trade wheat. It's at a different price. So then you can always pay someone back with chattel of any kind. The chol metaltal mate of ninu, because all chattel is considered to be easily tradable, is considered to be good quality. The next part is the isha shehizika. Then the Imrei Yaakov says, what if a woman is who's married causes damage. Now, what about her property? So now she has to pay, but what if all of her property is tied up in her marriage, which is the halacha? So how does she compensate the injured party, and does her husband have any level of obligation? So im yesh la mamun shein la bal rishus bo shalemes ma shehizika. So the halacha states in Shulchan Aruch that she has to pay for her own damage. The husband bears no responsibility. But what about her assets? If she has assets that the husband has no control over because she received a certain asset, right? Let's say after she got married, she received an asset which was given exclusively to her on the condition that her husband would have no dominion over it. So halachically, it's hers, and that would be used to assess the damages. But in many instances, when a woman gets married, the ketubah entitles the husband to not necessarily outright ownership of the property, but it would give the husband control rights over the course of the marriage. That's what we call nichse milug. And while we're not going to get into that in any great depth today, but if a woman has a piece of property and she gets married, halachically, the husband has rights of control over that property unless they sign a prenuptial agreement, which explicitly indicates that the husband hereby withdraws any dominion over that property or anything else. You can always do a prenuptial agreement when a couple gets married, but that would be the nature of it. The derech tashlum hanazikin mavur b'shulchan aruch siman shin pei zayin, and the way that we assess it is explained in the Shulchan Aruch. Now, before we get into that, what happens if the woman has no independent assets and all that she owns is controlled by her husband? So then the halacha is you have to wait until the marriage terminates before you can actually collect it. What we do is we view this, the damage that she caused. She now has a debt to a creditor, and since she has no assets to speak of, and she'll only obtain those assets once either her husband divorces her or dies, and then pays her for her ketubah, this guy who was owed money for the damage that she caused is first online, among her creditors to collect from her assets that she obtains after the termination of her marriage. Okay. Next topic is the derech tashlum hanazikin mavur b'shulchan aruch siman shin pei zayin. Now, as far as assessing damages and how much you pay, so the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch echoes this, is the shemen kama haya hakli shava kishuhu shalem, the kama hu shaveh ata. You look at what the value of the item was before the damage and what its current value is after the damage, right? So if a guy had a tie and its current value as a 10-year-old silk tie is maybe, what would a 10-year-old silk tie be worth? You could probably buy it at a thrift shop for $5, right? And then I clipped his tie. I cut his tie in half. It now has no residual value whatsoever, or perhaps only, let's say, 10 cents residual value because of the material itself could perhaps be recycled. So then you take the difference between those two, $4.90, and you pay that difference to the damaged party. Now, this, you might think, is unfair because that's not the replacement value. The replacement value would be much greater, right? Because it was originally a $50 tie. So that's what we really have to look into, is replacement value versus real cash value. The hakli hashavur yishaer biyado, and then the material remains in the possession of the victim. In other words, I cut your tie in half, so you get to keep the pieces of the tie. I will pay you the $4.90, And below amrinan the hamazik yikach la'atzmo shivrei hakli o habeged hakarua. We do not say that the mazik collects the broken remnants of the thing that he damaged. And we do not say that he has to give him a brand new garment to replace that. And in this sense, the advantage is given to the damager, not to the damagee. And I refer you to what I write in the biurim. And this is really worthwhile for us to at least begin this commentary over here, because when it comes to assessing damage, it's really it's a sticky issue. It's going to be another gray issue, but it's definitely worth thinking about. How do you assess damage to a commodity that has already provided years of usage to its owner and would eventually have to be replaced anyway, or perhaps could be continued to be used by the owner for years to come? Okay, so that's the dilemma. Is anyone familiar with secular law about damage? All right, it's too bad we don't have a lawyer on the phone today who could provide us with some insight. But in any event, he writes as follows: the inyan shumas hanezek bizmanenu. So in the biurim, he writes as follows: as far as assessing damage in the modern time, yesh la'ayin eich ladun bazeh. We have to sort of think about how we're going to deal with this. Because the Shulchan Aruch states as follows: Arei sheshiber kelav shamin kama haisa hakli shava v'hu shalem v'kama shava ata u'mishalem hapchas l'nizik ad kam l'shana. So it says exactly what he quoted from in the Imrei Yaakov. You take the difference in value between what it was worth right before the damage, what the remnants are worth now, and the mazik pays the difference between the two. And the Sma writes as well, just what we saw before, that we do not award the pieces of the damaged kli to the mazik, but rather the nizik keeps it. Umavur the derech tashlum hanezeku sheshamin kama hayashava hakli b'shata hezek. And so it's clear that the way of assessing damage is to look at the value of the object right before it was damaged. He says the problem is that conventions have changed in modern times from what they were when this halacha was originally written. Derubam kekulam ein darkam liknos begadim o kelim mishumashim, because there's very little market in today's world for used clothing. In other words, in the ancient and medieval world, it was very common for people to buy used clothes. In today's world, very few people buy used clothing. Yes, do we have thrift shops, right? Salvation Army and what's that place on right by Steeles and Dufferin? There's a big place also.
Value Village.
What is it called?
Value
Village, right? So I know my kids, I went with my kids one year to see if we could find a Purim costume in Value Village. Would I personally buy clothing there? Unlikely. I don't consider myself to be an upper class snob. It's just not something that I would normally do. You know, I'm sure they have very nice stuff, but I would most likely want to spend the extra money and buy myself a new suit instead of going to Value Village. I mean, I know that there are people who do, but that's not the norm. Okay, right? So I think I bought some toys at thrift shops. I think I've bought CDs at thrift shops. I got a great Hall & Oates double CD from a thrift shop a few years ago. But, you know, that's not, but I wouldn't buy clothes there, right? Now, V'im neshoyer kli obeged shehishtamshu imo mispar yamim kama hu shava l'machor b'shuk. He says if we would look at a garment like my example of the 10-year-old tie, right? Guy's been using it for a long time, and if you were thinking about how much it's worth, what its market value is, lo nucha lekabel ba'odo elasikum katan me'od biyachas lesikum sheshulam ba'ado. You would only get a fraction of what its original value was, because as soon as you buy something, even if you use it for 5 minutes, it becomes a used garment, and there's very little market for used garments. Once you take off the tags, you've already depreciated it in value significantly in most kinds of clothing. So that's the first problem. The first problem is that a guy could have an Armani suit that he's worn once. He paid $1,000 for it, but now that the tags have been removed and it's a used suit, it's probably not worth more than $100, right? And that's the problem, is that depreciation of used clothing is huge, and that doesn't seem fair, because if I end up spilling paint all over this guy's Armani suit and he's only worn it once, shouldn't I have to give him replacement value so that he can buy himself a new suit? There's no way that with what I give him for market value of his Armani suit, is he going to be able to buy a new suit? Not even close to it. So that's the first problem. And then he says, V'roi lahakdam od, mashakasav hashach simen ayin beis sifkat and kuf chavches, she'ein tzorech l'shalim kama shahadavar shava leba'olim, ela kama shuhu shava lakol. Now the Shach also says that we have to, when we take into account the value of an item, we take a look at its market value, not at the sentimental value to the owner. The owner could say that you've damaged the family heirloom. And yes, while we're sympathetic that, your bubby's vase has been shattered, or grandpa's tie was snipped in half, and it was priceless to you, but that's irrelevant to assessing damages. The damager only has to pay what its fair market value is, and not what its sentimental value is to you. That even though the owner has a great attachment to that item and it's worth, he would pay multiple times of its value for that item, nonetheless, we don't go according to his valuation, but rather the market value. He says this is also brought down in a responsum from the Shvus Yaakov, who talks about the following case. I went ahead and I damaged, a guy bought an esrog in Eastern Europe, and back in the day, you would pay an exorbitant amount for an esrog, and I went ahead, picked up my friend's esrog and dropped it, and the pitum broke, okay? Now, my friend, when he purchased the esrog, he paid an exorbitant amount that most people in the community would not be able to afford, and therefore would not pay that amount for that kind of esrog, okay? So when we think about the fair market value of that item, what if no one else in my region would pay that amount that I paid for that esrog? So I paid $1,000 for the esrog. While it may be that for me it was worth it to pay $1,000, but there are very few other people that I know of in the community that would pay that amount. So what is the fair replacement value? Is it what I paid, or is it what other people would pay to be able to buy that same item? He says, "V'kasav al zeh b'zeh halashon," and he writes, "Ma she'ein kein im ein nimtza misha hayalokcho b'damim elu, afshe hu hayam mahader mehuder min hamahadrin v'hosef midile yoser mishlish." He says, if you can't find someone in the region who would be willing to pay that amount for that esrog, and even though it's like a beautiful, beautiful esrog, and he added of his own money, a significant amount, more than he was obligated to, that you pay, let's say, I believe what this statement of Chazal is, that you pay a third of your own, and any add-on is contributed by God. I'm not sure what that means in this context, but the point is, he says, Mikol makom bazeh shayach lomar v'gunav mi beis ha'ish the hedjot v'lo legavoa. He says his argument is like this: Hashem gave you a beautiful esrog, and therefore, it's not really the guy who damaged it, since no one else really wants it. It's really almost like damaging Hashem's commodity and not yours. Avol mashe efshar lemachro tzarech l'shalem. Dezeh havi hezek mamon hedjot. V'tzarech l'shalem lo kol hezeko ad kan l'shona. He says that whatever could be gotten for this esrog in the open marketplace is what you have to pay. Even though you paid much more, you paid an exorbitant amount because you wanted to serve Hashem with a beautified item. But the fact of the matter is that no one else is willing to pay that amount. And therefore, you can't expect replacement value. You have to accept what that esrog would have fetched in the open market. Umavor desfirle the afshashilim harbe avor haesrog mikol makam hol ve'enu yachol lamachor b'sikum zeh sheshileim ein lechayev et hamazik b'tashlum rak kama sheshav lamachor achshav b'shuk. It turns out that the Shvus Yaakov also is of the opinion that it's not replacement value, and it's not what the guy himself paid, the original value that he paid, even when he's never used the object, but rather what the market could bear if this esrog were undamaged were to go up for sale. That's what you have to pay. So we've identified two problems so far, which where there's a certain lack of clarity. Number one, what do you do now that the standards have changed, where used items are only worth a fraction of the new item? And how do you assess the damage? Because it's clear from the poskim that you look at the value of the item, of what it was worth immediately before the damage was caused, and not what he originally paid for the item. And second of all, what do you do in a situation where a guy paid, as it's clear from the Shvus Yaakov, even if the guy paid an exorbitant amount, the damager does not have to pay him back for what he paid, but rather what the object would fetch on the open market. So both of these sources indicate that even though he paid a huge amount, and to replace it would be a huge amount of money, nonetheless, the damager gets off easy in these cases, and it seems to be somewhat unfair, in light of the severe reduction in value from new to used. Uvenasivas HaMishpat, he writes in this commentary to the Shulchan Aruch, he writes, Nira de davar she'enu shava ba'atzma l'machro v'likach damim ba'ado, rak sheshava li'ishahu, ein hamazik chayiv l'shalem. If there's an object that I damaged that belongs to someone, and it has zero value on the open market, but it has sentimental value to this guy, let's say his child drew him in kindergarten, or his grandchild drew him a beautiful picture, and I go ahead and I think it's garbage, and I take it and I crumple it up and I tear it up and I throw it away, right? So have I caused him damage? Clearly I've caused him damage. I mean, how dare you destroy a beautiful item that my grandchild spent so much time drawing? Does it have any value on the open market? No, it has zero value. The kid's clearly not a future Van Gogh or a Picasso, right? It has zero value. So according to the Nesivos HaMishpat, the damager does not have to pay anything in that situation. So based on everything that we've just written, where everything depends upon the market value of the object right before the damage was caused, so let's think about the following scenario. Reuven purchases a new garment for $100. And he wears the garment for just a few days. And Shimon goes ahead and tears the garment, whether intentionally or unintentionally is irrelevant. He tears Reuven's garment in such a way that no one is going to want to wear this garment now. No one normal is going to want to tear the garment with this tear. Gam achar sheyitukan hakera, even after you could repair the damage by stitching it up. It's a stitch. It's like it's got a tear right across the shirt. Who's going to want to wear that? So kama chayav Shimon l'shalem avor hezeko shehizik. So how much do we assess Shimon for tearing Reuven's shirt? Dihinei im hayushamanes habeged kama hayashav l'machor b'shuk. Afsha habolim lo holchu imo el zman katzar mikol makom hoil v'holach imo v'nasle de zebeged mishumash pachat harbe mishav yuto biachas l'mash shilin pa'ado. He says, on the one hand, Reuven's shirt right before the damage, he might have paid $100 for that shirt, but because he wore it for 3 days, it's a used shirt. It's lost a huge amount of its original value. It may only be worth $10 now at a thrift store. Okay, Ula meidach gisa avor haba'olim shivoy habeged nisher kimat kemo chadash or lishtamish alo ela ma'at. Achshav yitzarech liknot beged chadash b'mei amana. On the other hand, if Reuven wants to replace that shirt, he's got to go back to the retail store and pay $100. So it doesn't seem fair to just pay him off with $10, market value of that used shirt. So this is the dilemma, and this is something that we'll continue with Amir Tzashem tomorrow. Okay.
Sure. I think we answered a number of questions I had. Sentimental value seems not to come into play at all. The other example I'm thinking of that maybe we can explore is cars, because I think there's a market for used cars and insurance and what they pay. And I think if a car is totaled or damaged beyond repair, they'll pay the black book or whatever, which is the used value of the car before it was damaged. And I think then they get to keep the salvage. So I guess that's kind of a way of looking at it, that where there's still a market for used.
Right. But also remember, again, even with cars, once you take the car off the lot, you've probably knocked off a few $1,000s off.
Absolutely. I think that's why new policies allow you to buy a rider, I think, for replacement cost for the first couple of years or something like that. You pay a premium for that, but that allows you to be made whole because you'd hate to lose your brand new car.
Okay. All right. We'll talk.